In this video, I want to speak personally and I hope historically and scientifically eventually as I move along about what could broadly be called our fascination with the past, and particularly with the material past, what people call archaeology, and what scientifically is called the field of archaeology. But I want to be much broader than that. The word archaeology, archaeos in Greek, ancient, old, really. We talk about something archaic, that's connected to the Greek word as well. But then what is old? If you dig in your backyard of your ancestral property, maybe your grandfather, or just imagine someone in your family owning something way back over 100 years, and you found a hammerhead or an axe head or something, and it was identified, or a jar, because they often have dates or labels on them, that was 100 years old. Would that be an archaeological artifact? You could probably say yes and no, depending on what you mean by archaeological, because they're legal definitions. Often people will say, well, 50 years, 100 years, then you're talking archaeology. But if it's newer than that, it's just stuff that you might find underground or even on the ground. The broadest definition of archaeology would be the material evidence of the human past. And when you say the human past, you really should probably add the ancient human past, but then it's the question of how ancient. So in most countries and states, there are laws as to how old something needs to be in order for it to be protected by the state. But either way, you know how metal detectors are often forbidden in various federal lands and so forth. That's because people will go and use a metal detector to find things, and then they'll start digging and uncover things and pull something out of the ground and put it in their pocket or purse or backpack or whatever and just take it. And maybe it is something that would be of significance to understanding the history of that area. So it could be archaeology. So it just depends on the situation, but theoretically, anything, I guess, over 100 years or so, especially if it has to do with the understanding of that place, could be considered archaeology. But legally, in the United States, it's usually like the 18th century or something along those lines. But then certain Native American sites are protected that might be more recent than that. So it's kind of a floating scale in terms of how old is old. But the thrill and the fascination, I think, is there regardless of the chronology. So here are some examples that I'll give you. When I was 10 years old, we lived in the Washington, D.C. area, my family, and my father worked at the Pentagon. He was a career Air Force officer. And I remember we made a family trip to Mount Vernon. And Mount Vernon is the ancestral home of George Washington, the first president of the United States. And I was so fascinated. It has furniture and dishware and other kinds of artifacts from his time. And it's also, there are excavations around the place to find other things that have been uncovered. And I haven't been there in many, many years. I'd like to go back and look at it again. But I remember coming down the back steps, and they were cement-like or stone, not cut stone, but some sort of poured stone. And I put my hand on the steps, and I was just thinking to myself, did George Washington sit on these steps, or did his feet go up and down these steps? Did Martha, his wife, did the children? Were these steps here then? And it made a big difference to me. If those steps had been replaced, and they really weren't from the time of George Washington, I wanted to know. So I asked a guide that was working there, a woman that was there, who was trained and knew the history. I said, are these steps original? I'm just curious. And she said, Yes, they are, as a matter of fact. I get asked that a lot. These steps and the wooden steps around, some have been replaced, but the stone steps are original. And I just sat there for the longest time. Another time, much later, I was visiting the home of Emily Dickinson. And I remember sitting on her back porch, which was wooden, but it hadn't been replaced. Some of the slats were actually quite loose, but it was the porch from that time. And I checked on that as well. And once again, who hasn't sat on their back steps or their front steps or whatever? We all do that. It's such a human experience worldwide to sit out front or out back by your house, wherever you would sit. And I was just, I love her poetry. I'm so moved by it on so many levels. And I just put my hand on the porch railing by the steps, and I thought, wow, Emily Dickinson probably sat right here. So what was that? That wasn't archaeology per se. It's the ancient past. It is material evidence of the ancient past, which is the formal definition of archaeology, which means the old stuff. And yet, we're not digging it up. We're not finding it some, ancient prehistoric site that's thousands of years old. But the grip that it has on our human imagination and our feeling of connection with the past is like time travel. Some of you probably watched Outlander. I know it's very popular, maybe read the books. And I've watched all 6 seasons. I have Scots, Irish, Welsh, Bohemian ancestry on my Tabor side that I've been able to trace. And I'm just fascinated with that period of history of the 18th century and even the 17th century as well in the UK. And I have a lot of just genetic connections that I can trace and genealogical connections, but I'm just fascinated with the history as well. And American history the same, whether it's a Civil War battlefield or whatever. It pulls me. And normally I wouldn't like a film or TV series that had time travel. I'm more into realism. Obviously, if it's the film Memento or Matrix, I would make an exception because they're such fascinating films. But generally, I don't want the walls to move, voices to come out. Dreams are okay, I guess, and visions, but time travel, nah. And yet, I love that series, and one of the reasons I loved it is because I was thinking, I was time traveling when I sat on George Washington's steps, right? I went back and sat on his steps from the 1700s, and he had sat on those steps, and even though he wasn't there with me for me to talk to, you see the idea. It's the fascination with that connection through material objects. So that was one of my earliest experiences beginning to think like that. I've always thought like that. I taught at William and Mary, the College of William and Mary, and I was always interested in which buildings are original and which have burnt down and been rebuilt. And there are some that are original. And once again, if they've been rebuilt, interesting, you can kind of see what they were like. But if they're original, Thomas Jefferson went to William and Mary, and others that I have studied and would be interested in. And so Colonial Williamsburg's right there. I bet many of you who are watching this video have visited there. It really is an amazing thing. But here I am, James Tabor, always thinking, what is original? Same thing in the Holy Land. Some of you have seen that video I have up now. My first visit to the Holy Land at age 16. And I was just obsessed with this idea. But is there a step or a stone or a wall or something still standing from the time of Jesus? Because I was fascinated with the historical Jesus, even just before college, on my first Holy Land trip when I was 16. So around that time, when I got back to the States, we went to a family reunion on the Tabor side. And the Tabors have 9 kids, my father's family. and I think they had 10. One died as an infant, as was so often the case in those days. My father was born in 1911, just to give you an idea of the chronology, and I think he was the third. But anyway, my grandfather had an old home place. This is Causey, New Mexico, but it had burnt down. The house had burnt down. It was a wooden frame house, and I was just so fascinated with it because of my father and his family growing up there. And I think as a kid, I had visited my grandfather, but not at that place, at a more, later place that he lived at. So I was talking to one of my uncles, and I said, and I think he was the oldest one, and I said, is that old place that burnt down, is that still, could you see anything? And could you take me to it? And he said, oh, I think you can see the steps and some foundation materials. So guess what? I said, I want to go see it. Now, I didn't even think of it as archaeology, and I hope technically it wasn't, and I didn't violate any laws of New Mexico, because we're probably talking about, 75 years or something like that, going back a ways. And I got a shovel and a pick and a couple of boxes that I could maybe put things in if I found anything. And we drove out to the old home place. And it was all grown up with weeds, as you would imagine. But I could see the steps. They were concrete. I could see where the fireplace was. And I asked my uncle, where was the kitchen? And I think we're able to tell by some of the plumbing and so forth that was coming in, where the kitchen was. And I don't think there was an inside bathroom, but an outhouse. But we could kind of figure it out. And I was particularly interested in the, as I recall, there was a living room and then two other rooms, a kind of, or a front room, you might call it, and then maybe two bedrooms, and then a eating room or a dining room, or it was a combo kitchen. So it was a 4-room house. So I wanted to know where my grandparents' bedroom was, and it was in the back corner, I'll never forget. And I was able to kind of figure out where the windows had been, and there wasn't much left, just, some like ruins of burnt timber. But I started digging where I thought there might be a closet, because my uncle told me, there were closets in the rooms. And guess what? Such a thrill. I heard metal, and I pulled out what I would call a strong box, a metal box with a lock on it that people would keep their papers, their treasures in. Now, my grandfather was very poor, a cotton farmer. My dad grew up very poor, first one to ever go to college in his family. So, I didn't expect to find a bunch of cash. But the lock was easy to open. It was all deteriorated, been underground for all that time. And there were some papers in there. But one thing I found, here it is, and I put some lamination on it years ago. Boy, I wish I hadn't done that, but I didn't know anything. I didn't know better then. And you probably can't make it out, but if you look carefully at the signature line, in pencil, it says D.F. Tabor, Daniel Franklin Tabor, and it's made to a feed store or corporation where he was a farmer buying some kind of a feed or something. I'm telling you, right now when I'm holding this, I just wish it didn't have the lamination on it, but I am just thinking, my grandfather touched this paper and he wrote across it with a pencil, and there's his signature. Wow. It moves me. Later, my grandmother on my mother's side gave me this little fragment of a letter that had come from her grandfather, 1891. And you won't be able to read it much, but I can read it. And I've lost part of it, but I have transcribed it front and back. And his name is R.B. Sturdivant, and he's writing to his wife, "My dear absent wife, I've not heard anything from you since the 2nd day of January." So he's writing this letter. I have this actual letter. Fortunately, I didn't put lamination on it. It's in amazingly good shape. I'm beginning to think this is archaeology. Maybe his DNA is on it and I shouldn't even be touching it. But I know quite a bit about him. I've learned a lot about my own genealogy. So what is it that fascinates us about these things? Here's something that you'll learn about me personally. I've told my students this many times when I teach courses in biblical archaeology and the archaeology of early Christianity. But this little leather pouch I carry with me anytime I go out, not in the backyard or whatever, but if I'm wearing, pants with pockets or whatever, I carry this little pouch. And if you open it up, I've got a couple things in it, but the one thing I'm going to talk about, these all mean a lot to me. They're objects. This is a belt buckle that was given to David Horowitz back in the 1920s, and he gave it to me. And so it's all the way back from the Holy Land in those early days. But this is what I want to talk about, this ring right here. I'll put it on my little finger, that ring. This ring is my grandmother's ring on my mother's side, my mother's mother. Her name was Nora Del Wright, and she wore it her whole life. And I'll never forget, again, I was 10, 11, 12, and I used to touch her hands, how you'll do when you're a little kid with your grandmother, kind of, grandmother, your hands are beautiful, and so forth. And I would ask about that ring. And she said, she called me Jimmy, which is my given name. And she said, Jimmy, I've never taken that ring off since the day your grandfather put it on my finger at age 17. And my grandmother was up in her 70s or 80s by then. And I looked at that ring, and I just couldn't believe she's never taken it off. All the years, all the events of World War I and World War II and all the things she experienced in her life, she's never taken that ring off. And I said, Grandma, what's going to happen when you die? Who's going to get the ring? And she said, well, I don't want to be buried with it. I do want someone to take it off. And I guess it'll go to whoever it might mean the most to. And I said, could I have it? I probably shouldn't have asked, because I'm sure, but I've talked to my sisters, they understand, and my mother agreed. And she said, yes, you can have it. So when my grandmother died, my mother saved me this ring and she gave it to me, and I carry it with me all the time. What is it? It's a gold ring. It's not particularly worth that much in terms of gold. It's very light, one of those little gold bands. It's worn very thin. You know how they get very sharp when they're old. But it connects me to my grandmother. I mean, we all revere these material objects. So that human sense of being at a place and going back in time and touching the past, I think it's with us all. Now, what if, this is ridiculous, I'm just playing around here, but what if I said, I made up that grandmother story. I thought it would be a great story to thrill you. This is actually just a ring that I found somehow in our family. I don't know who it belongs to. All of a sudden it would lose its meaning because it wouldn't have the, quote, archaeological context, you see. Wouldn't have the history with it. And so obviously if things are fake or forged and you think they're real, they can create the connection and even the emotions that we feel when we find something. But that's why forgeries of antiquities are really very tragic, because not only are you falsifying something and not getting real history, but just that sense that you're really dealing with the material past rather than something recent that's been concocted is really important. So I have here some objects I'm going to talk about, and then I'm going to tell you how this has influenced my own work. These objects are all ancient, and I'll go through them really quickly. These are part of a teaching collection that I use in my lectures and so forth. And they're on loan to me as part of the work that I do and the research that I do. This is a bowl from the time of Jesus, a dipping bowl. So if you're reading in the New Testament, Jesus dipping his hand in the bowl, it would have been a Roman bowl like this. And this is typical Roman thinware from the 1st century CE. And I'll set that down there. This is a necklace. The bowl was found in Jerusalem. This was found in Jerusalem. Of course, it's been put back together, but it's a necklace. And it's from the 2nd century BC, and it's associated with what we call the Hasmonean period. It's not particularly valuable, meaning, I mean, it might be valuable as an artifact, but I mean, it wouldn't be what a wealthy person would wear. And it's made out of various kinds of cut glass and stone, but it's very beautiful. But somebody wore this. Again, these artifacts don't have a context. That's why we're able to use them as a teaching collection. If this had been found in a proper excavation, it would be recorded and it would be kept, and it might even be in a museum, depending on how rare it was considered to be in Jerusalem, and this would be under Israeli jurisdiction. But anyway, it does amaze me as I try to imagine. This is probably the most common object. You know, I study the historical Jesus, but I like this one in particular because it has been used. You can see the burn marks. This is an oil lamp. You pour the oil in here with a linen or cotton wick, and I haven't lit this one, but I have a replica here that I use in light for students just to show them how it works. But this replica is not 2,000 years old. This is probably the most common thing found. This kind of lamp is found in every home. It's pretty ubiquitous. We call it a Herodian lamp. It's very simple, doesn't have any animals or carvings or writing on it. It's just a simple oil lamp, and they're found all over Jerusalem. Thousands of them have been found. This one, it was cracked, but it's been repaired. You can see the crack. And so it doesn't have a museum value, but it does have a kind of a teaching value. A little piece of it just came out of the middle where I've kept it. So, again, the connection. I've dug these lamps before in Jerusalem, found not this lamp, but pieces of lamps like this. It's pretty common for my students to find a lamp or a piece of a lamp just like this from the 1st century. And they find that thrill of touching something from 1st century Jerusalem, because most of them are taking my courses, so they're interested in ancient Judaism, early Christianity, what we call the late Second Temple period. This is pretty chilling. It is a Roman crucifixion nail. We have a lot of literary accounts of crucifixion. If you look on my blog, jamestabor.com, and type in the word crucifixion, I'm making this video last day of August 2022. So if you're going to watch it anywhere near the date that it's made, you can find an article I just put up on crucifixion and what we know about it from archaeology. It went through the heel, so the heel rested actually, and about this much of it would go into the wood to hold the heel up and the weight, and then the victim was also tied. But this was found near Herod's palace, and it's on loan to us through Shimon Gibson, who is the archaeologist that I work with, who dug outside the walls of Herod's palace, and that's where this comes from. We now know a lot more about crucifixion, where they put the nails for the hands, where they put the nails for the feet, how the victim died, and so forth. You can look that article up, jamestabor.com. This coin, I remember when I was writing my book on Paul, I kept this coin out all the time on my desk. It's an authentic coin. It's a silver denarius, and notice it has the image of the Emperor Nero. And I thought of Paul going to Rome, being tried during the reign of Nero, and this coin was found in the Holy Land, that is, in the land of Israel. So whether it really ever made it to Italy or not, I don't know. But we have found coins of the Roman Empire, of course, in the land of Israel, particularly in Jerusalem. But something about Nero's image, when I would hold this, I would think not only that it's 2,000 years old, but that somebody carried this, somebody held this. This particular coin, and I have quite a few coins, this little one, here it is, it's so small I can barely see it because of it. This is a coin that comes up in a story that Jesus tells in the Gospel of Mark in chapter 12 about a widow who's poor, so no husband, no man, as we would say, poor, no money, and basically not a male. She's a woman. So you might say in that culture, it's 3 strikes against her. But she's overlooked by everybody, and Jesus notices that she puts 2 of these copper coins into the treasury at the temple in Jerusalem as her gift. And he says to his disciples, you see that woman there? She just gave more than anyone here in this entire temple. And it's the day before, a couple days before Passover. It's leading up to Passover week, when there are hundreds of thousands of people coming from all over the world, bringing what would be the equivalent of millions and millions of dollars in gifts and offerings to the temple. So interesting. We find these all the time. It's about, as you can see, probably a fourth the size of a United States copper penny. These 2 things are the last 2, all of these so far, 1st century CE or AD. Alabaster cup to put ointment in. Probably it's too small for a drinking cup, probably, but some sort of a precious ointment that you would put in, hand-carved alabaster. And this is one of the little vials that you would use for perfume or anointing. These are both from the 1st century, both found also in Jerusalem. None of these things are particularly rare. There are lots of them found, but these are examples of some everyday things. This is the oldest thing I have. It was given to me years ago by an Israeli friend of mine, and I've checked with the Israel Antiquities Authority, and they don't want it. It's not considered valuable, but technically it is an artifact. But all we know is it came from Beersheba, but it is from the time of Abraham, 2000 BC. So this is 4,000 years old. I guess it's the oldest thing in my house, really, by far. And the soil is still on it. And I think it was pretty much, you can see here, it's very well preserved, the color, and there's even some markings you see on the rim. So it was protected in a kind of a cave or some sort of a protective site, but it was laying in the mud like that, so the mud is still on it. So the whole idea of this is, I've been talking kind of personally about feelings that we have. You know, when I take students to dig, or even when I lead tours, and people go with me, normally on the tours, of course, we don't dig. A couple of times we have dug, like a day or 2. We include that as part of a tour, but usually we don't. But when I go with students on tours, they usually dig for a week or 2, sometimes 3 weeks, sometimes a month. The first excavations and explorations I did at Qumran, they were done, we stayed a whole month. And so it just depends. And students get their hands dirty, as we say. They learn archaeology. They learn the science of archaeology. 99% of archaeology is recording, careful recording. Now, I want to clarify, I'm not an archaeologist. To be an archaeologist, you need, typically in our society, at least in the West, to study in a department of anthropology. And archaeology is a field of anthropology. It's one of the 4 or 5 breakdowns of doing anthropology. And those who choose it get trained in all the methods. Now, I've done a lot of archaeology, always under the guidance and supervision of trained archaeologists. But I've also been on the licenses of several digs legally as a co-director, because as a historian, I also have a place in understanding and interpreting, and I've done so much archaeology for 30 years now that, I'm not going to take the professional label of archaeology, but I know how digs are conducted, let's just put it that way. So, these students, I'm telling you, they just, and people that I've taken on tours that get to do a bit of actual digging, it's just amazing. And immediately this thing that I'm talking about comes out. And I'm not going to try to reproduce how it sounds, with people. Mr. Tabor, Dr. Tabor, Dr. Tabor, look, I found this, I found that. And it's a thrill. The first coin you find and the first artifact you find that's really ancient. And depending on what period you're interested in, what period you're in. Now, I do want to say that if you do proper archaeology, it is not treasure hunting. People come by our fence at Mount Zion, where I've been digging for 15 years. We haven't dug the past 3 years because of COVID restrictions, but we're finishing up that dig and we're going to publish it. But people come by the fence. They're not allowed into the site because it's licensed. And they'll always say, "What are you finding?" And I tell the students to say, "We're finding everything that is here." Remember the day we started digging at Mount Zion, and I don't care if there was a cigarette butt on the ground or whatever, that's a start. That's the first thing that you find. So you find everything that's here. You're not treasure hunting. You're very carefully bringing down the layers of that particular site and trying to discern and understand from the material evidence of the human past things that are left behind by humans that they made, or in some cases skeletal remains of animals. If you find an animal bone, I guess you could say, well, that's not the human past, but certainly if it was killed by a human and eaten by a human and it's near a cooking pot and a campfire that's ancient, then it becomes part of the story. You're trying to get the story, you're trying to reconstruct from the material culture what the lives of people were like. Now, there's a little bit of a twist to it here, because if you talk about finding a text or an inscription, what if this bowl right here had an inscription, maybe somebody's name, which often is the case, or even we found a stone vessel that had several lines inscribed of cryptic Hebrew that we think is a kind of an amulet or prayer, blessing and cursing, various kinds of things in terms of a ritual meal. Then the writing also becomes part of the archaeological record. So the Dead Sea Scrolls we call archaeology, even though they were found in caves. And the word digging, has to be used advisedly, meaning whether you actually dig or if you walk in a cave and you find a jar that goes back to the 1st century AD, when the Qumran community living in the Dead Sea, some people call them the Essenes, you can hear my videos on that, whether they were the Essenes. But anyway, you might not have to dig. I remember one of the excavations I participated at Qumran, I think it was in 1996, and we found nails of sandals from the 1st century on top of the ground along a path leading to the caves that we were excavating that had apparently been, sort of washed down and maybe exposed by the weather over the centuries. But it's amazing how things will stay in the desert. Everything doesn't get covered over unless you're in a very Sahara-like area where huge sand dunes cover things periodically. But in the kind of deserts around the Dead Sea, the material is pretty hard that you're walking on and that you're working with. So there's also geography. Now geography, let's call it the lay of the land. And then there's monumental kinds of things like remains of buildings and so forth, as well as all of these artifacts, as well as writings. So when you take all those together, you try to get the story. And geography is important. For example, if you go with me to Israel, I will show you how Sepphoris, the urban capital of the Galilee, is just 3.5 miles north of Nazareth, the village of Nazareth. And when you're at Sepphoris, you can see where Nazareth was. It's a modern city now, but where it was anciently. And so knowing that geography is important because people ask if Jesus grew up in Nazareth, did he ever go to Sepphoris? And by being on the ground and seeing the geography, you begin to understand the distances. I'm not going to name the scholar, but there is a well-known New Testament scholar that was writing about Sepphoris, and he said he doubted that Jesus would have ever gone there. And yet, I think you can make a good case that he would have gone to Sepphoris. It isn't mentioned in the New Testament by name, but Herod Antipas is mentioned, and his palace is in Sepphoris, and it was the urban capital. And Josephus, the historian of the 1st century, the Jewish historian, tells us a lot about Sepphoris and what it looked like. And I've excavated it at Sepphoris down to the 1st century levels in a couple of buildings. And so, just having that geography, for example, Jesus said once, a city set on a hill cannot be hidden. Well, think about it. If he grew up in Nazareth and looks north from the hills of Nazareth, and it's built on these hillsides, he would have seen the city, and it would be lit up at night with all the oil lamps and torches. So a city set on a hill cannot be hidden might be referring to his own experience, that kind of thing. And to walk. What is it like to walk from Jerusalem to Jericho? It's 17 miles. You go from 2,400 feet above sea level to 1,200 feet below sea level. How does that feel? The ancient Roman road you see occasionally along the modern road. And I've stopped the car sometimes and gotten down to the ancient road where you can spot little portions of it that remain. How does that feel? That's the setting of one of the most famous stories Jesus ever tells, the Good Samaritan in the Gospel of Luke. He says a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. Now you understand the down. I've never walked the whole thing. I want to do it before my time comes to fly away or whatever, go back to the dust. And so maybe some of you will do it with me someday. I hope it won't be in a wheelchair. I'm pretty good at hiking, but I'd like to walk from Jerusalem to Jericho. But remember, in the summer, it's way over 100 degrees, like it is in California right now. It's pretty brutal. But maybe in the winter it could be done. Now, I wanted to say this particular book that I've been talking about a lot lately, the Jesus Dynasty. I'm going to end here, but I want to talk about my academic career. Like I said, I'm not an archaeologist. And I began doing graduate studies in the late 1960s, early 70s. And I got my PhD in 1981 from the University of Chicago. But I was studying primarily texts. So this book is based heavily on texts. Obviously, the New Testament, the Gospel of Thomas, the Didache, some of the Dead Sea Scrolls all play a part in me constructing what I think might be a plausible reconstruction of Jesus as he was in his own historical times. But what I hadn't done in those days and did not do until 1991, so just about 30 years ago, I'd gone to the Holy Land twice, but on tours. But I hadn't ever done archaeology. And I began doing archaeology, and it changed everything. Not only did I meet major figures in the land of Israel and in the United States and in Europe that work in the archaeological field that I'm interested in, that is Second Temple Judaism, but I got to participate in some of the most important excavations. So the book, The Jesus Dynasty, is heavily populated or filled with illustrations and maps and pictures of places and artifacts and things from the archaeological record. So I wanted to just say that it has transformed my own work. So even though I had the fascination at age 10 to sit on the steps of Mount Vernon, what about sitting on the steps leading up to the temple, the Herodian temple on the south side of the Temple Mount, that are now uncovered, and those are the first century steps? Or what about the Pilgrim's Way, as it's called now, that's being open to tourists? And the group that I'm taking in October and next March will definitely visit that if it's open. I think it's open now. And you will walk on the actual pavement that everybody walked on going up to the temple. I'm talking about my favorite people that I study: John the Baptist, Jesus, James his brother, Mary his mother, Mary Magdalene, all the apostles. They walked this pathway when they would go up from the pool of Siloam, where you would dip yourself to have the ritual purity, in order to be able to go up to the temple and be ritually pure. And that's alluded to a number of times in our gospel records and our various Jewish sources. So, being at a place where something happened, whether it's steps, whether it's artifacts, whether it's the geography, the lay of the land, is really important. Now, this book, which was next in my publications, The Jesus Discovery, is about almost completely archaeology. And it's about tombs, ancient tombs in Jerusalem. Over 1,000 tombs have been open now, mainly because of all the building around Jerusalem. And there's what we call a necropolis around Jerusalem on the north and on the east and on the south, a little bit on the west, but mostly kind of a ring around the north and the east and the south, and over 1,000 tombs. Unfortunately, in the early days, many were looted, and that's strictly against the law, obviously for good reason, because you destroy everything and you end up with just things that get sold on a market, but they're virtually worthless in terms of having any real historical or scientific meaning. But if a tomb is found by a building crew, let's say a condominium's being built, they come across a tomb, then everything is stopped and the archaeologists are called in and they do what's called rescue archaeology. But it's not necessarily in a hurry, depending on what it is. It might be something really extraordinary, and there's some cases where buildings will be built later and the ancient remains underneath the building that were exposed will be preserved so that visitors to the building can walk down below and see the remains. In the Jewish quarter in Jerusalem, I always take my tours underground, and you see the ancient city of Jerusalem in the Jewish quarter that's all been uncovered. And you're walking 15, 20 feet below the present street level, but you're walking finally on the level of, say, the priestly palace that you can go into and even walk in the rooms. And they've been preserved, even though the upper levels are destroyed. It's amazing. So whether you come with me, whether you read the books, whether you watch the videos, I hope this will mean a lot to you, and I'm going to bring a lot more to you. In October, Derek Lambert, who is the host of Myth Vision on YouTube, and Neil Sinlak, who's the host of Gnostic Informant, are going to go with me with their cameras, and they're going to film the whole tour that I do, that I call Tracking Jesus. And I share with the people who go on the tour everything that I've learned historically, textually, archaeologically, geographically, and we rate things on a scale of 1 to 5. And I let them do their own ratings because it's interesting. In other words, if something is very, very likely to the point of certainty, we would give it a 1. And if it's moving towards maybe, but we don't know, maybe give it a 2 or a 3. And a 5 would be pretty speculative. For example, if I say Jesus probably was a stonemason and he worked in Cephas because Cephas was being built at the time he was growing up in Nazareth, that's probably a 3. I mean, I can't absolutely show that he worked in Cephas, but it's not unlikely. But if I take you to the steps south of the Temple Mount, or the path going down to the Pool of Siloam, and even sit on the edge of the Pool of Siloam that's partly excavated, and I tell you, Jesus and Hillel and all the rabbis of the first century, Yohanan ben Zakkai and Rabbi Gamaliel and the Apostle Paul and all the apostles and Mary Magdalene, everybody walked down these steps into the pool or walked up the pathway to the temple. That's a 1 for sure. So we try to, we speculate if we need to, and I try to always make clear, even in my books, I say maybe this is true, we don't know. I'm trying to be very careful with the evidence. And there's a lot we don't know, and a lot of it is guessing, but I hope it's guessing in the direction of evidence. And you always can ask then, what is the evidence? That is, if you assert something, you affirm something like, I believe these steps are the Herodian steps of the time of Jesus, and he would have walked on these steps in his time. I'm not going to tell people that unless I'm pretty sure, and I'm very sure about that. I would say we're certain because steps don't move. They're carved out of the very bedrock leading up to Herod's temple. So that's the video, and I hope you found it inspiring and useful, and I hope it'll spur some thoughts in your own life.